Your recorder just there, it's on.
My name is Casey McFarlane, and you're listening to the Consciousness Continuum. Today, I am honored to introduce two wonderful guests. Dr. Dennis McKenna is here, and he's what I consider a pioneering force within the psychedelic revolution. He's a brother of Terence McKenna, with whom he has done extensive research into the realms of consciousness in regards to entheogenic plants. Dennis is an ethnopharmacologist, a research pharmacologist, a lecturer, and also an author. Recently, he has founded the McKenna Academy, a 21st century mystery school. We also have Dr. David Nichols. He is one of the world's leading experts in psychoactive drug research. He is a medicinal chemist, a pharmacologist, as well as a founder of the Hefter Research Institute. Welcome back, folks. It's an honor to be here with you both.
Afternoon.
Thank you, Casey, for inviting us. Dave should really get top billing here. I mean, I'm many things, but he's, you know, as I told you in an email, Casey, David is probably the world's authority on both the chemistry and pharmacology of psychedelics. So, you know, and got his bona fides legitimately in that Dave was pursuing psychedelic research, basic research, all through the 70s and 80s and 90s, prior to the psychedelic revolution, whatever that is. I mean, he was a pioneer, but he was also, you know, a successful academic working in this very controversial area, you know, and David, because of David, who's been a mentor for years to me, I'm also on the Hefter Research Institute, which he founded. And I don't know that I'm contributing a lot to it, but at least they let me stick around. So, you know, so David is the man you want to talk to, because you can reach me. Not that I won't participate, but he's the brain you want to pick here. You know, I'm all over the podcast.
Give yourself some credit, Dennis. Yeah, there's something to be proud of that. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's quite honorable that you were involved with these things before it became popular, you know, because there's so much stigma attached to psychedelics, and people are, you know, a little cautious to even listen to what you have to say sometimes. So I think that's wonderful that you not even are interested in it, but you also pursue education and scientific knowledge about it as well. So, yeah. David, do you believe that the compounds other than psilocybin present in the mushroom play a role in the profound healing that people experience? I know folks reference the entourage effect regarding cannabis, so that's kind of what I'm talking about.
I think cannabis is a very different situation from mushrooms. Cannabis has hundreds of different types of terpenoids and essential oils and things in it, and we really don't understand the role of those in producing the overall effect. I mean, they say THC is the principal psychoactive drug, but you have all these other terpenes and other isomers, delta-8 THC and cannabidiol, and they may well make some contribution, as you say, as entourage effect, like a stew of cannabinoids. In the mushrooms, we don't have evidence for that kind of diversity. There are a couple of simpler compounds. In addition to psilocybin, there's baeocystin and norbaeocystin, which are the monomethyl and demethylated analogs of the nitrogen. But recently, those have been synthesized, and all indications are that they don't really have any psychoactivity. Now, that's not to say they couldn't be contributing something. For example, we know that the monoamine oxidase in the liver breaks down DMT and slowly metabolizes other types of tryptamines like 5-methoxy-DMT and probably psilocin as well, but not very quickly. So it's possible that if you have a large presence of some of these other baeocystin or norbaeocystin, they might be competing with the monoamine oxidase and indirectly prolonging the effect of the psilocybin. But as far as enhancing the qualitative nature of the effect, there's no evidence that you have the same kind of situation with mushrooms that you have in cannabis.
Yeah, recently there have been some beta carbolines identified as mushrooms, at least in a few varieties. A German group, which was really kind of a surprise, because mushrooms have been chemically examined for decades, and they were the first to come up with this. So the beta carbolines could potentiate the psilocybin in it. By being monoamine oxidase inhibitors. On the other hand, I think the concentrations of those beta carbolines are actually quite low.
Yeah.
And they may not have much to do with it, but just kind of surprising that they were there, because, this is what you find in ayahuasca. This is the basis of ayahuasca pharmacology, is beta carbolines plus DMT. But it's an interesting finding. Whether it's significant, who knows?
Huh.
Yeah,
so the inhibitor, go ahead, David.
My reading of these papers, though, is that the concentration of the beta carbolines is probably not physiologically relevant. They're there in trace quantities, so it may not really contribute. Certainly, if you give someone ayahuasca and then they take mushrooms, the psilocybin is dramatically potentiated by an additional MAO inhibitor. But I don't know if the concentration of the mushrooms of the beta carbolines is high enough to really have much of an effect, because psilocybin is not metabolized very quickly to begin with compared to something like DMT or 5-methoxy DMT. Just psilocybin itself is not metabolized very quickly.
Right.
So is that similar to the inhibitor that is present in the ayahuasca brew? Is that what you're talking about there?
Yeah.
Oh, that's fascinating.
Beta carbolines.
Yeah, similar compounds. The beta carbolines are, in ayahuasca, comes from the vine component of the brew, the Banisteriopsis caapi. Those are the MAO inhibitors, and then DMT from the admixture plant. And of course, DMT is not orally active by itself. It has to be potentiated by the beta carbolines. So that's the basis of the pharmacology. And in ayahuasca, you're getting a big load of beta carbolines. So if you take mushrooms in combination, which I sort of don't recommend, but some people do, you'll get a profound potentiation of the activity due to the beta carbolines. I tend to, sort of not advocating mixing psilocybin with beta carbolines in a sense, because it's orally active by itself, and if you're not getting enough of effect, just increase the dose and you'll be quite satisfied, and in general, the idea of mixing these compounds is, to be avoided, except in the case of something like ayahuasca, where the activity depends on this combination,
Yeah. So you say it's quite a minuscule, like a little amount in the mushrooms as opposed to the ayahuasca brew.
Right. Yeah. They're vastly different. Yeah. Ayahuasca, the beta carbolines are there in really milligram concentrations, tens of milligrams, and then these mushrooms are just trace amounts.
Right.
Do you guys feel as though the naturally derived psilocybin mushroom or the synthetic, one or the other, is more cost effective, or are they kind of both, like, to produce them for healing and therapy on massive amounts? Do you feel as though one is more cost effective? I'm not sure if that's your area of expertise or not either, but I figure you might have some knowledge there.
If you have to buy a synthetic psilocybin, if you could buy it at the cost of manufacture, the dose would cost maybe $50. And I don't know how many mushrooms $50 would buy. I guess if you had a good supplier and had good mushrooms, I don't know, Dennis, do you know what $50 would buy for mushrooms? How many grams?
$15? Well, if if you go by the standard Terence McKenna heroic dose measure, that's about 5 grams. So 15 grams, probably $1 a gram. $15 would buy you 3 doses. Yeah. Of course, when we're talking about some of this, synthetic psilocybin in clinical trials, which are now being used in clinical trials, those have to be very high quality, so-called GMP, good manufacturing grade, pharmaceutical grade psilocybin. And that can be quite expensive, as the companies that are trying to develop this know. That could run to, hundreds of dollars a gram. But they're using them in a structured clinical, in an FDA-approved clinical trial where the purity has to be 99.9%, if achievable. So that's going to raise the cost. Yeah.
I guess another aspect with the synthetic, it's probably easier to gauge the be more consistent with the potency as well. I know the mushrooms can kind of vary quite often. You can take 1 gram and you can have a really intense experience, and then you might take more than that and you might not feel it as much. So that's probably a component as well, the consistency with the dosage, I would imagine.
Yeah, that's one reason that the FDA requires high purity GMP material, so that the dose-to-dose consistency is very high. And you're exactly right. Mushrooms can vary depending on where they're grown, what species, and the climate at the time they're grown, were they grown indoors, grown outdoors, wild, cultivated. You really don't know. You probably have to just have somebody who had taken some dried mushrooms and said, oh yeah, 3 grams was a good dose. Somebody else would say, oh, I always take 5 grams. You don't really know how much is there.
Exactly.
With psilocybin, you weigh it out and you say, there's 25.0 milligrams, or there's 30.0 milligrams, or whatever.
Yeah, you can't really regulate the doses of mushrooms the same way, because of this chemical variability. Fortunately, though, psilocybin is such a non-toxic compound, but you can, that doesn't really become an issue. It's hard to. And Dave, I don't even think there is an LD50 that's ever been determined for psilocybin. Is that true?
Well, we don't know in humans. I suspect there probably is one here. Well, mice metabolize it really quickly. So I don't know. It's probably not very toxic in mice or rats either. But it's a fairly benign substance compared with most psychiatric drugs.
Definitely. And more inherently safe, at least on the metabolic level. The dangers of psilocybin have to do with inappropriate setting. That's where people get into trouble. The compound itself is not toxic, not dangerous in most cases.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's quite an interesting point in time. It feels as though, who's to say for certain, but if we were to look back in our history as humans, we sure do seem to have some sort of relationship with these mushrooms all over the world, So we're coming to a point now where we're recognizing that, and we're accepting it slowly into society. So I feel as though this could create some much needed massive shifts within our paradigm that we're living in. And I also think that it is important for both to be available, because some people who work a 9-to-5 job, who are very much, suit and tie, and they've never done mushrooms before, well, the therapeutic clinical setting with the regulated dose of psilocybin is going to be what they need. And that being said, maybe someone would like to take the actual mushroom, so it should also be available, I think. Do you guys see both being available to people in the future?
The decriminalization of psychedelics will make more people probably experiment with them because they won't have the fear of the legal consequences. I don't think that psilocybin or LSD or MDMA, for that matter, will ever be legalized in the sense that you can just order it and buy it. legitimately. You can order it off the internet, of course, and get it. But I don't, because you can get in psychological problems if the set and setting aren't proper. Somebody going to a crazy party and eating 3 times or 4 times the dose of psilocybin can get into really serious psychological problems, can do dangerous things, carry out dangerous activities, etc. There really needs, in my opinion, to be a level of supervision. Now, people can argue about what that level of supervision should be, but even for recreational users, I think it's foolhardy to take recreational psychedelics without somebody there who can watch over you, the sort of so-called designated driver. So I think for treatment, the paradigm is there. It's always going to be pre-screening, measured doses, and integrated follow-up with the set and setting. Recreational use, I think, can be problematic, even though they're not toxic. I still think that they're not benign. They're not people have tried to draw analogies between cannabis and psilocybin. And cannabis it's apples and oranges. Cannabis, at some of the concentrations of the stuff they have now, that 22% THC, can produce panic reactions, and people can develop dependence on cannabis. But I just don't see a parallel really between cannabis and magic mushrooms or psilocybin mushrooms. And people have tried to draw that parallel, but I don't think the parallel is very good.
Yeah, that's a good point that you raise. It seems like that's very accurate. Like it's been popular amongst, party settings, like you say, and festivals and whatnot. And that's all fine and dandy. And it is great for some people. They take a good amount and they come back sane, but some people don't. Some people take way too much and they have absolutely no idea what they're ingesting. And they're forever kind of tainted from that experience because they haven't had the opportunity to integrate what they've learned or even understand what was happening, right? So I like what you say, that set and setting is a really integral part of it. And to have that available with a therapist in a clinical setting can provide, some kind of groundwork for the experience.
Yeah, the important thing is that there is a structure around these things. The set and settings can be quite variable. But there needs to be a well thought through set and setting, whether it's a very clinical type experience with a clinician, a therapist in a hospital or something like that. Generally, even the clinical studies they're not carried out in hospital rooms. They're carried out in pleasant spaces that have been more or less set up for that experience. We know that mushrooms and all these psychedelics have been used for thousands of years in shamanic settings. And shamans are also kind of therapists. They're not doctors, but they're experienced in how to structure the settings and guide people through it. I think that both are probably valid approaches to using these things. And in the outside the clinical setting, most people are going to go to either go to a retreat center or something like that and have these experiences. I think the important thing is that the experiences should be approached thoughtfully. They should be taken, seriously. Recreational use, whatever that means. That's a very, sort of multifaceted term. But let's call it psychospiritual use or use for self-discovery or consciousness exploration or that sort of thing. That can take place in a shamanic setting. Thousands of years of shamanic use of these things shows that, indigenous people know how to use these. And most people don't have access to a traditional shamanic setting for mushrooms, unless they go to Mexico or someplace like that. But there are contemporary so-called underground therapists. Hopefully they won't have to be underground much longer with the decrim things happening. But underground therapists often borrow heavily from traditional use. So, whether you could call it co-optation or whatever, but in fact, they learn from the traditional side. And so the sessions might be quite different than a clinical setting, but basically a safe setting with all the elements, preparation, help people get through the setting, and importantly, help them to integrate it. I mean, that's, those are kind of the three primary stages for any kind of therapeutic use of these psychedelics, whether it's a, clinical study or, at a retreat center or something like that. But those elements, need to be present in the protocol of the sessions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Integration is very, very important. And it seems almost trendy these days, folks just taking off, blasting off and just bragging about how far they blast off. And then they're not really here while they're here, they're not actually taking that information that they've acquired and having the capacity to integrate it into their life to make positive decisions and shifts in their life. So, just having a sort of container and someone able to hold the space for them, whether that be a therapist or whether that be a shaman or whatever it is, because and it seems like the more that we release the stigma around it, the more we're going to be able to weed out the kind of phony schmucks, so to speak, because you also have to be careful. There's quite a few folks. I'm not sure about therapists. I haven't really looked too deep into that, but I do know that in the Amazon, for example, you really have to know where you're going, because a lot of people use that container as an opportunity to do negative things rather than healing. So, just kind of
It's quite true. And I would like to just note that this is, anytime you're dealing with a powerful spiritual, something like mushrooms that's spiritually potent, or any kind of potent spiritual practice, yoga, that sort of thing, within that space, there will always be people who are a little short on ethics, and they may view that as a power, a way to dominate people and do things that, are not appropriate. So the most important thing, as you say, you have to, don't just register for the first ayahuasca retreat that comes up on a website. You have to work through networks of trusted friends, and people that, can guide you, and most of all, you have to trust your own judgment, because, there are power freaks everywhere, and they will use these spiritual technologies. Look at the abuse that goes on in churches and this kind of thing. So, spiritual technologies, which is what these things are a two-edged sword, like any technology. It can be used beneficially, it can be used to harm people. And it goes on in the therapeutic space as well. Just because a person is a therapist doesn't mean that they're ethical. And there are plenty of instances where they're not. So.
Yeah.
I think your point is well taken, that these psychedelics especially are extremely powerful substances. And there are many people that use them to get power over other people. When you hear about so-called shamans who commit sexual abuse and sexual assault and mix all kinds of nicotine and so forth in, and basically exploit people because of the power these drugs give them. And people need to stay away from those type of individuals. And there are a lot of them, because there's a great opportunity right now with the popularity of psychedelics for these, I don't know what adjective I would use, but unscrupulous, doesn't quite, make it, but unscrupulous people who would use these substances to get power and control over people and abuse those people.
Yeah, and so this is, this is one of the pitfalls. That's why you have to proceed carefully and with clarity. I mean, just it doesn't always have to be related to sexual abuse. It can just be related to, I mean, the shamanic context and the use of these in a therapeutic, in a ceremonial context can, there's a temptation to make it into a cult, where there's a following some person. And if that person is an enlightened, decent person, then that's not so bad. But,
Most of the time.
Not all of them are. Not all of them are. And you have to be, you have to trust your own judgment and look at what the CIA has done through MK Ultra and all that. They've used these substances for mind control, and there's, I'm sure you're familiar, there's a whole sordid history of the way the CIA has abused psychedelics in their, quest to find better ways to brainwash people, basically, and control what people think. And spiritual institutions in general, a big part of their agenda is to control what people think. This is what religion is basically about. So it doesn't all involve abuse. I mean, religions want people to buy into their dogma, to buy into their set of belief systems, and that's okay as long as it doesn't cross the line to, coercing these people in some way. So it's a tricky area.
It's like it seems like it's really necessary to be aware of these things, but at the same time we shouldn't shy away from them just because of that. Like you say, they are a powerful technology, and they do have the power to do good. So it almost reminds me of like technology, like the computer and internet, for example, and machines. And right now we've created such massive advances in technology, but we're not utilizing it in the right way. We're destroying the earth, we're pillaging her, we're raping her. We don't have to be doing that. We could be helping her. We could be working alongside her. So like these medicines are meant to help us get to where we want to go, but we have to treat them with reverence and respect and be really cautious as we navigate the terrain, I think. Yeah.
And that's true really of any technology. I think technology has no moral qualities inherently. The moral quality comes from us, comes from within the human heart. And in a lot of my talks and lectures, I often say our cleverness has outstripped our wisdom. In other words, we are very clever, and we can manipulate technologies that, if misused, can have tremendously adverse effects, even to being threats to life on the planet. We don't have the wisdom in a lot of cases to use these technologies, and often don't have the common sense to avoid using them, to making that critical decision. Just because we can do something does not mean we should do something. That's where the wisdom element comes in, and that's where the moral judgments come in. So, it's a tricky area. It's not inherently the technology, psychedelics or anything else. The challenge is our own moral development, our own moral compass that we, apply to these things.
And I feel like it kind of comes back around to knowing who we really are, because if we knew who we really were, and that we come from the same thing that the air comes from. We're all part of the same energy in different forms. So we wouldn't use these technologies to destroy our environment, because we have the understanding that we actually are a part of the environment, but we're human at the moment. So that's kind of where I think that these medicines can come and help us if we use them in the right way, and we're smart and we are cautious and we have respect for them. They can help us to get back to the roots of who we truly are. And I don't think we've ever really lost it. You know, we've just got a little bit clouded. We have some kind of smudge on our glasses, so to speak.
Right.
But it's always there.
Yeah.
And I would say we've lost touch with the planet and nature. We were primarily an agriculture, hunter-gatherer society all through evolution. Evolution was millions and millions of years. And now within the span of 100, 150 years, all those roots have been basically thrown out. Families lived in villages. The grandparents lived there with the parents and children. Everybody looked out after each other. They all worked together. They understood that they had to work for the common good. And now people, you know, I get a PhD and I moved hundreds of miles away from my parents. And then my son goes to school and he lives hundreds of miles away. And another son lives over here. And everybody's fragmented. You've lost this stability and structure that we used to have. And so these technologies are kind of the same way. If you're introspective and you use them in the right way, I think they can be good for personal development. They can help you discover, you know, reveal things you've forgotten about yourself or didn't realize you were doing, and you can improve yourself. But if absent that kind of, you know, introspection and self-awareness, they're just, for some people, they're just party drugs. I mean, a lot of people just don't, they're not into that. You know, look at climate change.
Right.
We have a split, but so I would say most people, I don't know what the statistics are, but most people, I would say in the United States and the world, in the educated, developed countries, recognize that we're destroying the planet with our pollution. But there's still a significant percentage of people that say, you know, this is a hoax, this, you know, and even our leaders have been propagating this. So we've just become very fragmented. And again, I think this emphasizes the need to use these in a way that's respectful of their power and with people who can guide us in the proper directions. Otherwise, you know, it's just creating more chaos.
Yeah, and psychedelics are a technology, but in a way they are a kind of unique technology, because they can be learning tools to help us learn how to be better people, you know, smarter, more intelligent, more ethically grounded, all of these things. And you know, you don't get that from all technologies. These are unique in a certain sense, is that they're really ways for us to learn, you know, to be better humans.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Um, it seems like even say people are at a party and no one has any idea what a mushroom is, but they hear they're cool. Some people might have a bad experience, but then again, it seems like the mushroom kind of has a way of, like you say, Dennis, improving people. And even if it is a rough experience, like, I'm not telling anyone to just go out and party with mushrooms, but it seems as though we have the capacity to kind of like analyze our experience and bring something back from it and improve some aspect of our life. Like, I know a lot of people who had no knowledge of psychedelics, and 3 years down the road, they're treating their spouse better, and they're enjoying life more. They're going out and they're actually looking at the trees and they're breathing the air, and they're kind of improving on their life. So it's definitely a slippery slope for sure. It really is, but it's worth talking about for sure. It's also been challenging because for the last little while it's been illegal to study them, right? It's been kind of hush hush, and the war on drugs happened, and it wasn't okay for anyone to really be making clinical studies on these substances, I don't think anyways. So yeah, it's been hard for anyone to really talk about its efficiency or its toxicity or its effects.
You had people like, you know, Aldous Huxley, who described his meth cleaning experience when he died, was injected with LSD to help him make the transition. Lots of poets and philosophers from the beginning of the 20th century, early 1900s, really were looking at these, and it's just they've been around and they are a powerful technology, but they have to be used in a respectful way. And I think there still are a lot of people that even if they accidentally are given a dose of LSD or psilocybin, some of them have an experience of, aha, I suddenly realized, what the world was all about and life was about, and their lives improved. But there are a number of people where that doesn't happen because the setting, the preparation weren't there, recreational settings, party settings. So they still, it's a two-edged sword. Used properly in the right kind of setting, they can be beneficial. We know that they increase the personality aspect of openness, which if you're more open, you're more altruistic, you're more humble, you're more open to other people's ideas, you're basically a better human being. But that doesn't happen for everybody. It's like all technologies, they have a positive aspect, but when misused, they have a negative aspect.
Right.
Mhm.
I think the substances this is a testimony to the fact that they are inherently benign, more benign. I mean, people can have an unstructured experience and benefit from it. They can come away with insights because it stimulates insights. It's much better, though, if they do it in a structured context where you just increase the chances, basically, that they are going to have a good experience that they can integrate that will stick with them. But there's plenty of anecdotal evidence, for example, like Dave said, of people taking these things recreationally or without any particular spiritual or therapeutic goal in mind, and yet they come away with these revelations because at some level, we're all open to that. I mean, I like what Roland Griffith, who's done a lot of the work on psilocybin as a mystical experiences. He doesn't talk about mystical experiences. He talks about profoundly meaningful personal experiences. And we all yearn for that, don't we want all that? I mean, I think especially in this culture, we find ourselves in deficit of that. We want that. We long for that. Sometimes the mushrooms or the LSD or the ayahuasca will bless us with that, whether or not it's a highly structured situation. But for safety reasons and all sorts of reasons, your chances are better if it's a well-structured set and setting. You're deliberately putting yourself in a place where you need to lower your defenses. You need to deliberately surrender. And in order to do that, you have to be sure, number one, that you're in a safe place, where nobody's going to take advantage of that to abuse you, or you're not going to get into trouble by, walking into the traffic and things like that, although that doesn't really happen much. But you know what I mean? You can open yourself to the experience and get more out of it if you're sure that the context is safe. You don't have to worry about those factors anymore. You can just surrender to it and learn what there is to be learned.
Mm-hmm.
When I talked to the pharmacy students, I gave a lecture on psychedelics, and I would talk about how important set and setting were. And I would say, let me give you an example. Suppose that you've read all this Eastern literature about enlightenment and yogis having enlightenment and priests and prophets of old having enlightenment. You've read a lot of this literature, and you've read literature about psychedelics, and you're convinced that if you take a psychedelic, that maybe you'll have a religious experience, and so you decide to take one, what LSD, psilocybin, and you go to a church or synagogue, and they're playing evocative music and people are singing the praises of God or whatever, your probability of having a religious experience is very high. Take the same dose of the same drug and go to a Friday the 13th or Freddy Krueger movie. And as soon as I say that, the whole class starts laughing because they know exactly what I'm saying. It's the antithesis of something that would be focused on personal spiritual development. And then I say, you will not have a religious experience in all probability if you go to that Friday the 13th or Freddy Krueger movie. So that's a good example of study and study. It really illustrates. And you don't have to think very hard about, oh, yeah, that would be really, really different.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, that's a really great way to put it. Because it's like you can do whatever you want, but you know, you're going to have a better probability if you set yourself up for the experience. And another thing I was thinking about, people who don't have any knowledge about psychedelics and they do them, and they see God and they're seeing life as it is, and they're like, holy crap, like I'm a part of this and this exists. And it almost seems like sometimes people can take it as that's them, and because that's them, they are the most important, but they're like kind of missing a part because they're not the most important. Everything is that, so everything exists and matters just as much as they do. And it almost seems like that could come into play with these kind of shyster shamans, I don't know what you want to call them, but people who take advantage of others in those kinds of situations. It's kind of an interesting thought. Like you see a lot of folks these days in the New Age movement who are very self-absorbed and think that they are the almighty brouhaha, or whatever you want to call it. And I think it's quite dangerous, and it's something that should be avoided if possible.
Yeah, these substances are, you know, if you're a sociopath, for example, or a bad person, these are not going to make you a saint. You know, I mean, they don't work that way. They present you with the possibility of being a better person, but you don't have to accept that, you know. And if you have a certain agenda or a certain personality disorder, it's not going to be a cure for that particularly, you know. And these people are not interested in cures. They're interested in consolidating power. For example, this is one reason why I say, you know, people say, well, you know, if only Trump would take a psychedelic, he'd have these revelations and then it would all be good. No, it's not going to do any good. You know, you have to have a soul, you know, you have to have a conscience. You have none of those things. Sociopath.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, a curandero that I've worked with a lot in the Amazon told me one time, he said, there are two kinds of people I will not give ayahuasca to. One is schizophrenics, you know, because it just won't help them. It will probably make them worse. And the other is sociopaths, because, and I think we all know lots of sociopaths who take tons of psychedelics and they're still jerks. You know, I mean, it is, you know, right?
Yeah, and some of them continue to take psychedelics because they have this delusion that they're improved and they're better and they grow personally. And you say, this guy's been taking psychedelics for years and he's still a jerk.
Yeah, hasn't learned a thing. So the inbuilt human capacity to delude ourselves, you know, psychedelics are not going to automatically be a cure for that. They can give you insights, and then it depends on what you do with your insights. You know, it begins after the trip. You know, how you integrate it and how you change based on what you've learned.
Yeah, intention's a big one too, I think, like what people go into the experience looking to achieve, and integration and intention also. Yeah, and they're lacking a lot from people just recreationally taking them. And I'm not shunning that or saying that it's bad, because personally, I had no idea what psychedelics were. And I found myself in a situation with friends and I took them and I had quite a weird experience, but about 4 years down the road, I got more interested, and I did some research, and it happened to be the best experience that ever happened to me, and I'm quite grateful that they exist in recreational settings. But if there could be situations where integration was encouraged and intention was informed, people could know and have a much easier transition to get to that place without, kind of wandering about in the dark and trying to decipher what's going on.
Right, right. I mean, the word recreational use, it is stigmatized in a certain way, but if you look at the word recreation, right, in some ways, psychedelic experiences are recreation, so you can have a recreational experience that is recreational. It just helps if, and sometimes that happens no matter what the context is. Well, I mean, within limits, whatever the context is, probably, but you can have these recreational experiences even without a highly structured ritual setting. It's just that you're more likely to have a meaningful experience that you can integrate that will have lasting positive effects if there is a structure, if there is an appropriate setting. That helps you to process it and integrate it. These substances are never going to be, at least I hope they're never going to be, things that you get in a prescription and the doc says, take 2 and call me in the morning. It doesn't work that way, and that would be very irresponsible for somebody to do that. So that's why the intent therapeutic support is so important for these experiences, and that's one of the big challenges when we try to integrate psychedelics into biomedicine, because what does that do to the economic models? Because the economic models for mental health delivery and most forms, is the take 2 and call me in the morning model. You go to see a therapist, doc, I feel bad, I don't feel very happy. You walk out of the consult, if you're lucky, you've spent 10 minutes with the therapist, you walk out with a prescription, and that's pretty much the end of it. There is no ongoing support. Psychedelic therapy requires that therapists spend a lot of time with their patients before the experience, during the experience, and after the experience. And that costs a lot of money in the current model of healthcare delivery. So how do we get around that, or how do we make that work? Obviously, it's complex. I mean, insurance companies and other players in this field are going to have to change their understanding of what's cost effective.
Mm-hmm. And what I think about often is like Ibogaine, for example, and we have this massive pretty much an epidemic of opioid crisis. These people dying away on the streets all over the world, and because we have bad drugs and people are addicted to them, and it's not good. So like your average Ibogaine treatment would cost between like $5,000 or $8,000, I think, as far as I know. What I wonder, like, how is someone who is homeless, addicted to opiates, going to get $8,000 to help heal themselves? So I would love to see this be able to be accessible for people, who don't have the money to get it, because what's going to cost more? Having somebody on the street who isn't in their power, who isn't competent, they don't feel good, they're stealing, they're struggling to survive. That's quite costly. So, like, I wonder which ways we can make it accessible to people, like what that would look like. It's quite a complex issue.
Big question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is a big question.
What do you think about this, Dave? I mean, what's your perspective?
No pressure. It's not exactly, you're not an economist or...
There are people that are looking at this question intensively because they recognize if you have hundreds of millions of people who are depressed, there's insurance companies don't even have enough money to cover all those people with their therapy. If you talk about having, 6 to 8 hours of total combined therapy before and after, and two therapists sitting with you for 4 to 6 hours, making $150 an hour each, plus the rental of the room and everything else, it's not economically feasible. And there are people looking at this. Insurance companies aren't that interested in it, but the people who are trying to drive this, Compass and Eleusis and these other companies who are trying to develop these therapies are looking at how can we get, payers to come up with this? How can we show that it's effective, that in the long run it's going to save money? Certainly, if you've got somebody who's seeing the therapist on a weekly or biweekly basis and taking SSRIs and other drugs for 5 or 10 years, it's going to be cost effective if you can give them one session or 2 sessions with psilocybin. But that case has to be made to the insurance companies before they're going to buy into it. And I haven't seen any indication that there's a viable model yet developed for that.
Right. And again, it may be that the more traditional context, like the retreat center context, where you actually are doing group therapy, that may be a way to, to restructure this so that it is more cost effective. Rather than the focus being on a single one-on-one interaction with a therapist, it's more like a group experience like we get with ayahuasca and so on. So you got one therapist, call him a shaman therapist or just a therapist. I think as we move into this, these practitioner roles are going to migrate together. The psychedelic therapists of the future are going to look like a lot like shamans, and the shamans are going to look more like therapists. You're going to see this synthesis, but the shift to a retreat center setting where you can actually have groups of people that are undergoing this, that can be very therapeutically powerful as well and more cost effective because the people, you have multiple subjects, patients, or whatever treated at the same time. It helps with the therapeutic dynamic because everybody can share their experiences and that supports the group. And what I would like to see, and this goes back to what we were originally talking about using the natural substances. I would like to see, I think the decrim movement is encouraging, even though it's fraught with pitfalls and all that, but I think it's encouraging because it opens up the possibility that every community could have one or two of these wellness centers which are working in the open. They're not underground. They're licensed and regulated to a certain extent, but they look a lot like retreat centers. And it would be a place where you could go and get psychedelic therapies, but within the context maybe of holistic medicine. Maybe they offer a number of, different holistic modalities that would help people. Not just a place you go to take psychedelics, but maybe it's a place you go for yoga or a place you go for some, nutritional counseling or other types of things that might go on there. And among that is the option to take psychedelic. And I think that's my personal feeling is that is, that's going to be the viable model going into the future. And in those contexts, people may prefer to take natural psychedelics like mushrooms rather than synthetics because of cost factors, but also this feeling that, well, natural is better, right? Natural is not necessarily better, but there is this feeling that, it's nice and natural. Now, Dave will disagree with this because he's devoted his life to synthetic chemistry. But like I tell people, even synthetic compounds are made by all natural organic chemists.
Yeah.
So, it's not out of nature to take a synthetic. And sometimes a synthetic is appropriate,
Mm-hmm.
LSD or something that you would not take if you're going to take LSD, it should be a pure compound, not an ergot derivative, even though maybe they were using that at Eleusis or whatever. But, you know, we don't want to go there because we know ergot is, you know, potentially very toxic if it's not prepared properly. Nobody would use ergot, or maybe morning glory seeds, but yeah, LSD is best ingested as a synthetic, you know, or semi-synthetic is what it is. But this is what I would like to see, is this happening. This may also be a solution to the whole ayahuasca tourism thing, you know, because people go to South America to have these experiences, and it's a mixed bag. You know, they bring economic benefits to these communities, but they also bring challenges. You know, all of these foreigners with fat wallets and certain expectations can adversely impact these communities. But if you have retreat centers that are working in the open in North America under legal, you know, reasonable legal regulation, then you can work with indigenous people to produce the medicines, export those to North America, and also you can impose quality control on the medicines to some extent, and everybody benefits, and it helps maintain, you know, it produces economic benefits for the indigenous communities. It helps prevent the depletion of the resource, right? Like, because they have cultivation operations. You know, I mean, my spiel these days is bring the medicines to the people. Don't bring the people to the medicine. That's my vision for the way to go forward with this. You know, and these community centers, these retreat centers, can be a positive force in the community. You know, I was impressed. I did projects. I did a study with the UDV. You know, one of these Brazilian religions that use ayahuasca, and they have temples. People come to the temples to have their experiences. But you could go to the temple on any given day, and there are people there doing things. Maybe they're having a banquet, or, you know, they're playing soccer. They have community outreach programs. These folks, you know, they go into the inner cities and run free clinics, and they're very socially conscious. And those communities in the States could adopt a similar model, where the local psychedelic retreat center is actually seen as a kind of community center to bring people together. You know, they not only provide the psychedelic therapy, but provide a range of programs that brings people together. You know, lectures, concerts, whatever. You know, and I think that's the way to do it, in my opinion.
Yeah, I really like what you said there.
That's your utopian vision, Dennis.
You didn't know I had such a wonderful.
I think it
megalomaniacal view of this, right?
I think it depends on what you're trying to accomplish. In Europe, psycholytic therapy was the main form of therapy. What psychedelics started in Canada with alcoholics, and
That's
I think,
right.
and you know, and Hefter sponsored a group therapy session of AIDS survivors who are demoralized, and it was in a group situation, I think in San Francisco, and the responses were very positive. That worked in a group setting, where you psycholytic therapy, where you talk and you bring out and people share. But I think in other cases, like with Matt Johnson's study at Johns Hopkins with tobacco addiction, best outcomes came when people had these overwhelming positive experiences, these transcendent experiences. And maybe the same thing is true with alcoholics. So it may be that for general people, for treating depression, whatever, maybe even PTSD, people could be in a group and you do a group setting. I agree that's probably reasonable. But I think there probably are indications where you need the overwhelming experience, where someone has a severe, you know, long-term addiction to something that needs to be broken, and just talking about it probably isn't going to get you there.
Yeah. I mean, exactly. There are definitely situations where you do want a very focused one-on-one interaction with the therapist, something like addiction or something, well, smoking is a kind of addiction, then that's probably appropriate. But for a lot of these things, because, these, at least for the UDV and to a certain extent, the traditional use of ayahuasca in Peru, most of the retreat centers are, the problem with them is that they're not owned by Peruvians, they're owned by gringos, and there's a monetary model and so on. But the intention is benign. But to have these kinds of centers, your example of ibogaine, Casey, is interesting. I think ibogaine. There are things that are unique about ibogaine's pharmacology in the sense that for opiates at least, it tends to reduce this craving. So you can have the experience, and then you have a certain window afterwards where you're not subject to the craving that drives you back to the drug. But the thing is, in my opinion, and I've never experienced ibogaine, probably never will, but I've talked to many ibogaine therapists, and they tell me that you really have to plan your experience in terms of what is going to happen after your therapy. You have to really think about it. You have to be prepared to change your whole life. If you take the ibogaine, you may be temporarily liberated from the craving, but then it's the choices you make. If you go back to your same neighborhood, your same friends, your same habit, it's not going to work. It just will not work.
Yeah.
So you have to approach this with a clear eye and a clear plan for what happens after the therapy. And I think that's true of a lot of psychedelics. The real work begins after you go home, after the retreat is over.
That's kind of where integration comes into play too, and it seems like it seems like it's moving in a kind of a positive direction at the moment in regards to awareness, releasing stigma, decriminalization, mental health, accessibility. And another thing, I like what you said about the communities, like having a kind of a community setting where you can have all sorts of things like herbal therapies, psychedelic therapies. And in that sense, the people who are underground will have the ability to have quality control. And like, if it's so stigmatized and it's not accepted, then there's no blueprint. People just do what they think is best. And if we can release the stigma, then we can ensure people's safety, and we can ensure more positive experiences to come about, I think. And yeah, like some people just need a bath. Not everyone needs to do psychedelics. And I think that's really important. Like some people need just straight up therapy. Some people need, maybe they need to see a naturopath. Not everybody needs to do psychedelics, nor should everybody. And I think that's quite important to stress.
Yeah, so there's a place where people can go to get what they need, and it doesn't have to be, like you say, maybe they just need a bath. Maybe they just need a compassionate person, to hold their hand and say, what's happening in your life, and how, it doesn't have, the focus should not be on the psychedelic. The psychedelic should be one of the tools in the armamentarium of these retreat centers, and there are plenty of them. There are, I think, far more retreat centers that are out there than we think, because a lot of them are operating underground, so we don't really know how many there are. But if these could come out into the open, I think people would be surprised how common they are, and every community could potentially have one or two of these, and that's the way to make this work, I think.
And it would be interesting to see it in communities too, because you could have native plants growing that are medicinal. You can have psychoactive plants. And as that happens all over, you know, they kind of interconnect, and you share different plants with the people next to you, and it kind of grows, and you're sharing the knowledge about what you believe with the people that you love who are around you. And yeah, I think that's quite important. But anyways, I think we're getting quite close with time here. Yeah, I really think this is an important conversation, and I appreciate both of your presences. It's been a great conversation.
Yeah, it's been good.
Always good to talk about things like this. It's going on, and Dennis, my good friend, and we have had many discussions, and I always tease him about being the plant guy, and he teases me about being the synthesis guy. So,
but there's plenty of room in the space for both. So
we share a lot of goals, though, about trying to transform society, making people more human, more aware, more empathic toward their fellow man, more compassionate. You know, we both, regardless of whether we're talking about plants or synthetics, you know, we both have the goal of seeing humanity sort of mature into being, you know, responsible for the planet, responsible for each other. You know, I mean, well, Dennis and I are probably both liberals, because I believe that medical care is a fundamental human right and everybody should get it without cost. And we don't have that in the United States. It's just terrible. So society needs to improve, and I just hope that psychedelics can be a small piece of that puzzle in helping improve our culture and improve our world, making it a better place for our children and grandchildren. I do have grandchildren. I worry about what kind of world they're going to inherit.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And like, we've gotten ourselves in such a mess, you know, we're kind of waist deep in the mud and it's sinking. So if we've gotten in such a mess, we might need something rapid to pull us out. And that's not to say everyone needs to do it, but psychedelics do seem to provoke a rapid transformation given the right situation. So yeah, I see vast potential for sure.
Yeah, they can rapidly transform people's attitudes and insights and so on. The question is it happening fast enough?
Mm-hmm.
When do you reach a critical mass where you say, yeah, we got this? We're not there yet. You know, I mean, people say, you know, that if everybody would just take psychedelics, we'd be enlightened, and, you know, well, that's not going to happen. And they're an important tool. They are not they're not the complete answer by any means. They're just
no, it's a whole bunch of things into one. You know, we have to look at the way that we organize as individuals in society. We have to look at the way we interact with medicine. We've got to look at food. We've got to look at all sorts of things, you know, and even like how we interact with our fellow humans. Like, if you look at an indigenous society, for example, they don't have all of this kind of judgment and mumbo jumbo going on. They live, and they don't. We just make things very complicated for ourselves over here in the Western world. We have a lot of unnecessary words, and a lot of the times we don't get our message across, even if we're using the right words. You know, people can interpret it in a way that's not what we mean. So yeah, I think it's way past time to strip down all the garbage and get on with the program for everybody's sake.
That's a good note on which to end it, I guess.
Yeah, have a nice evening.
Okay.
You too. Have a nice weekend.
Yeah, thank you.
Have a good weekend. Happy belated Thanksgiving to everybody.
Yeah.
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 May
Likewise.
2021 is going to